Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back again for another episode of Everything Compliance Day. We have the triplets of Jonathan Armstrong, Matt Kelly, and Karen Moore. And we've got a lot of great topics for you. So we're going to start across the pond, as is our wont with Mr. Armstrong. What do you have for us today, Jonathan?
Yeah, I've just done a podcast on the Compliance Podcast Network on Agentic AI, and I thought it might be useful to have discuss the same topic here, really, but with a slightly different flavor, I think. Agentic AI is obviously huge news on both sides of the pond. Now, I know because I've drunk the Kool-Aid and I know the new administration's mantra that everything good was invented in the US and the greatest technology is from the US. But even little old Europe has got with the Agentic AI program. Mistral, for example, whatever the French for entrepreneur is, a French entrepreneurial Agentic AI startup has raised 600 million euros worth of investment. Helsing, a German one, 450 million. H, another French one, 220 million. Unique Synthesia, 11 labs, around about 450 million-ish dollars between them. So there's a lot of money going into agentic AI. And as a result, the next salesman that knocks on the door knocks on your CISO's door or your project management team's door or your tech team's door is likely to have agentic AI in their sales promotions ready to sell it to you. So if you're a compliance officer and you don't know about agentic AI, now is the time to get up to speed, I think. So what is it? Effectively, it's AI that can autonomously make decisions and effectively go and recruit other AI agents to do tasks. For example, there is a rumor that those really annoying capture things that we get, how many traffic lights can you spot in this scene? There's a rumor that an agentic AI app has hacked that by recruiting another AI agent to effectively outsource the task to other people by saying, I'm a partially sighted individual and I can't do this task. Please do it for me. So agentic AI can, at best, think of fairly innovative solutions to problems. And that's why quite a lot of investment is going there because it's sort of often removing the human from the loop. And some of the early demonstrations seem very impressive. I was at one last week where it was said that the task of some 6 or 7 weeks could be done in a day. And agentic AI sometimes will set up its own almost mirror corporation with its own HR bot who's recruiting other bots to join the team to get the task done. But of course, that's not without its compliance implications. Just as whenever you're sourcing any technology, often our corporations would like to do due diligence on the corporations involved. And with agentic, that's much harder because you might not know who is being recruited to do the task because it's the bots that are recruiting and the bots deciding. So there might be issues, for example, with data. Now, obviously, DeepSeek, for example, is a provider that a lot of people are looking at, but they can't get comfortable because of the data location in China and the perception that if you put information into DeepSeek, it's going to be trawled by the Chinese government. But if you use agentic AI, then there's a risk that the bots don't know those sensibilities and they recruit on price or on speed. And so DeepSeek might be used for your tasks. There's also a struggle to meet transparency obligations. They're obviously very important under the EU AI Act, but also under GDPR as well. As we've talked about before, the majority of GDPR fines are around transparency. And it's hard to be transparent about how data is being used if you don't know yourself because the bots are deciding. Equally, decision making is something where EU regulators have been very involved. There's a case just a month or so ago involving Dun & Bradstreet in Austria that's gone right up to the ECJ, and they have said meaningful information must be given about the logic involved. And again, how do you meet that obligation to provide the logic involved if you don't know? You can't just say, we outsourced all that to bots and it's a black box and we don't know. The ECJ have said that there could be a black box defense in some cases, but that's something that's going to have to be ruled upon by national courts on a state by state basis. And that's not going to be an easy defense to pull off. There's all sorts of other implications too, I think, things like share sensitive data, invalidating patents, invalidating privilege, breaching sanctions, procurement regulations, IP issues, bias, discrimination. So a whole host of issues, I think, that you'll have to think of if your corporation is thinking of deploying agentic AI. So what are the solutions? I think maybe they fall into three categories. There may be more. It's obviously emerging technology. So we're thinking on our feet a bit here. I think, first of all, understand the technology. It's not good enough to have Armstrong's 3-line lesson on what agentic AI is. You probably have to do some proper research, a deep dive, look into the exact flavor of agentic AI that your corporation is thinking of adopting. Shadow AI is a real issue here as well, I think. You might not know that your business is using agentic AI, and it might be already. It might be something that your colleagues don't even know about because you're using, let's say, a consultancy firm that's using agentic AI to deliver a project for you and not telling you. The second thing I think you have to do is look at rule setting. So it is possible with any sort of agent to set rules to say you can recommend that we use another bot, but you can't hire them for us. Or you could theoretically go through some due diligence process that you build into that process and make mandatory. You could then audit against it to check that's being performed. But you're going to have to look at your own risk tolerances and set some rules for the bots rather than have them do whatever they like, whenever they like, wherever they like. And thirdly, at least in the short term, you might want to consider having a human in the loop. Again, it's hard, I think, for AI agents in the abstract to set rules, to understand your risk tolerances. And that might be something that means that compliance officers are not redundant, at least for a few weeks yet.
Matt, do you have a comment or question for Jonathan?
I have a couple of thoughts, and then Jonathan, if you do have a response, I'd be eager to hear them. But I was jotting down some notes about some of the phrases you used to talk about how agentic AI works. Agentic AI. I was about to say angelic AI. That did not work. But when you take some of these actions and you strip them down to their abstract compliance concepts, you start to see this takes you to some very weird places. So if the bot is hiring other bots, really that is third-party risk management. And
Yeah.
so how are you going to encode that into a autonomous thing? We know how to handle third-party risk management when there are humans going out hiring other humans. We have a good sense of what those risks are, what the mistakes would be, and how you would try and corral the humans working on your behalf. I'm not necessarily sure that we fully understand how to make that work with the bots. Second, I was thinking about how would the bot working on your behalf, who may then hire other bots also on your behalf, but how are you going to create an audit trail for what it is doing? And why did the bot decide to use this other bot instead of that other bot, or do this thing instead of that thing? But how are you going to make that audit trail? How is it going to be understood by humans? Where are you going to store it? Because I think if these bots essentially can work at limitless speed and do all sorts of things, that strikes me as that's probably a lot of data that we're going to have to store and correct. How do you keep it secure so the bot won't go in and redocument or change prior documentation to cover its own electronic ass, I guess, if it makes a mistake? And then even the point that you said where the bot might go and hire another bot. And my first thought was, hold on, is it going to be paying the other bot? Is it going to be distributing money to that thing? Because wouldn't bots work for free? Because they don't need money. They don't need food. And I kind of pick on that just to show that right now we have, I suspect, neither the legal framework to understand how we should govern this, nor the compliance procedures to steer agentic AI in the ways we're accustomed to, or even just the basic risk management principles that, okay, I don't know if AI is going to be regulated or not, but even if it's not, it could still do severe damage to a corporation if you're careless with it. So how are we supposed to, I guess, encode all of this? Because you're not going to train it. You're
Yeah.
going to, I guess, encode it from the start and then test its results. And I'll stop there, but I think I've depicted the mess that is in front of us right now.
I think you're exactly right. And I think that some aspects of this, of course, are already regulated, partly by GDPR. So there's 2025 fines, not involving agentic AI, but involving the same principles. So some of the food delivery cases are very similar to the risks with agentic, for example. And obviously the EU AI Act has banned certain practices from 2nd of February. So we don't know of anybody who's been enforced against yet, but that is theoretically a possibility. And I think you're right, where if we looked at this in the analog world, I'd say, let's say, for example, somebody called Cynthia spoke to your corporation's CEO at a cocktail party and said, I'm Cynthia. I'm really very bright and I'm new in town and I've not ever done a project before, but give me a bunch of dollars and a really critical project and I'll get it done. And the CEO will either say, get out of here, or how are you going to do it? And imagine Cynthia replies and says, you don't need to know any of that. I know people, I know folks, I'll get it done and I'll get it done. I'll get it done quicker and I'll get it done more efficiently. Give me the project. I suspect most CEOs would run for the hills. But if it's the same conversation with agentic AI instead of the fragrant Cynthia, then business leaders are buying into it. And I think sometimes it's the job of the compliance professional to be the grown up in the room and say, really? We've got the equivalent of, at best, a college grad in terms of ability to deliver the project who's sold us all of this stuff. Shouldn't we at least be slightly skeptical? And shouldn't we at least put some ground rules in place to make sure that delivery is going to happen to our risk tolerances? That's not to say they should avoid AI. That's not what I'm saying at all. There's all sorts of statistics that say, McKinsey, I think, had a survey out this week, I think, that says if you educate executives in the proper use of AI and they embrace it, then there are real productivity gains. So you can't close the door to this stuff, but you've got to have a proper risk framework.
Jonathan, I will just say your description of a college grad who's telling the CEO, trust me, I know how to fix it and I can do it for you cheaper and fast. You did just describe the operating structure of Doge here in the US. It ain't far-fetched, apparently.
Karen, do you have something for us?
Yeah, I just really building on what both of you have said, Matt and Jonathan. My concern, I suppose, is, Jonathan, you mentioned this ability to instruct the AI in a way that puts a lot of limits on what they can do and different stages at which they need to ask for permission, or they need to put a hold on something, or things that they can or cannot do. So I have just two concerns or questions there. One is, to me, with AI, and especially with agentic AI, it comes down to that genie granting you three wishes conundrum, which is, how do you frame those wishes in a way that doesn't have unintended consequences? How can you anticipate and then put in all of those checkpoints and barriers? But I think it's possible. And I think if, as you said, you talk to the people using or excited about engaging agentic AI and hey, look, we're going to go step by step. We're going to just release this agentic AI in a very basic way, and then maybe add some other steps as we test it out. My secondary concern really is sheer laziness. Is that once things get going and you see the possibilities and all the savings and all the really incredibly boring things that you can load off on the AI and all of the speed that you can conduct some processes in, is that people fail to either carefully frame those instructions and those steps, but also to monitor them, to audit them, to adjust them, and to change them going forward. Do you see the possibility of regulation having a role there, education having a role there? Do we need some really huge disasters to have some sort of a learning curve for businesses in their use of agentic AI? Where are those controls coming from?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I'll try not to get on to a traditional hobby horse, but boards aren't fit for purpose. I looked at the composition of a top 10 UK corporation last week that says that its future is effectively data and AI. It has 8 non-executive directors. 4 of them are accountants. 1's a banker, and 3 have random other roles that are nothing to do, it seems, with technology or AI. Who is responsible for discipline there? Now, I know this is a debate that a lot of corporations are having, but in some respects, there are other people in the organization, CISOs, for example, chief compliance officers, who are almost left holding the baby too much. And they're left making risk decisions because the board is not competent to do. So I think coupled with this increased use of AI, we have to think carefully about board compositions and make sure that people who understand those risks are on the boards of corporations. But we're still likely to make mistakes. And I think that's why, in some respects, I think I'm advocating for a somewhat cautious approach. If we had a relatively junior colleague, we'd say, do this bit of the task, check back with me, I'll check whether you're on the right lines. And we'd have these regular check-ins. And I know that a lot of technologists say, well, human in the loop slows it all down, destroys the pace we want to go at, etc., etc. So what? Make your bots easier to interact with then. Streamline that process. Understand the checks and balances that humans want from you, and think of a clever dashboard to present that information to make decisions quicker. You can't just say, because we can't be bothered to present the information that'll help you assess risk, we're just going to cut you out of that decision, because that's not a mature attitude either. So I think it's almost a design issue that whenever we're using agentic AI, we have to design in checks and balances and that human interface. And then coupled with that, I think you're absolutely right that it's an education issue for boards, particularly. We have to educate existing board members in risks and opportunities, and we'll probably have to change the composition of most boards to cope with the AI revolution.
All right, Matt Kelly,
Yes.
off-channel communications, signal integrity. Where are you today?
For the record, listeners should know I did try to invite Defense Secretary Hegseth to join our chat here today. I received no reply. So it is just the 4 of us here. We have nobody from the Trump National Security Team on this podcast. However, apparently they're on lots of other messaging apps gabbing away because, as we all, I think, now know, earlier this week on Monday, which already seems like a lifetime ago in Trump news cycles, The Atlantic broke the story of how several weeks ago, President Trump's national security advisor, Michael Waltz, accidentally invited the editor of Atlantic magazine, Jeffrey Goldberg, to a group text of the vice president, the defense secretary, the national security advisor, another special envoy to Russia that Trump had named, the director of national intelligence, the CIA. You get the drift. Everybody knows this. There was a private group chat on Signal of Trump's defense team that they had accidentally invited Mr. Goldberg to, where they were talking about bombing plans to attack Houthi terrorists in Yemen. And it's a whole big mess. And as of today, nobody has been fired for this yet. However, the day ain't done, and you always have to wonder about that with the Trump administration. But I was thinking through the ethics and compliance lessons from this Signal debacle, and I will carve them up into two. I wanted to start with the more prosaic compliance and policy management lesson here because, somewhat to my surprise, as I investigated it, it is not exactly clear cut in the federal government whether you can or can't use Signal to talk about sensitive matters. I looked into this, and apparently, as recently as December, the Biden administration, the CISA, which is the cybersecurity regulator in the United States, the closest thing we have to a regulator, doesn't actually issue rules, it just publishes guidance. It published guidance about acceptable ways to have secure mobile communications on messaging apps. And it recommended apps that provide end-to-end encryption and expressly said, like Signal. Okay, so does that mean that maybe it is okay for what they were doing to chat about bombing terrorists on Signal? Maybe not, because in 2021, the Inspector General at the Defense Department had published a report investigating a mid-level bureaucrat within the Defense Department who had been accused of fomenting a hostile work environment. That turned out not to be true, but along the way, that IG found that he was violating policy because he was using Signal to communicate with defense plans, or not necessarily confidential plans, but they were just using Signal, he and his underlings, to have a group chat to talk about their department matters. And that IG said that is a prohibited use. So before we even get to the leadership and the sheer stupidity and integrity lessons of this whole thing, I was struck that there's a policy management failure here. To this day, after geeking out about this for 5 days, I still can't figure out, can you use Signal or not if you're in the Defense Department? Or can you use it if you're in other parts of the government, but not defense? Can you use it to talk about routine things like securely discussing where you're going to get lunch, but not confidential things or classified things like bombing terrorists? Can you use it if you're down here on the org chart, but you're not up here at the top of the org chart? I don't know. And I've looked around several times now, and I've read other published reports about whether this is or isn't permissible. And I think the answer is still, it's not clear. So before you even get to who should be using Signal and exercising good judgment and setting tone at the top, do you have a clear policy for all your employees in your organization about what is an acceptable use for messaging? Because it looks to me like the federal government doesn't, which I am kind of astounded by, because classified information is not a novel idea in government circles. Messaging apps are not new technology. What are we doing here, people? And this, I think, is the fault of both the Biden administration and the Trump administration, and cutting through. They don't have strong, clear policies about what are employees supposed to do. I'll stop there with the more mundane compliance issues. I actually think that the real lesson here, and I'm sure most other people would agree, is the real lesson here is just the culture and integrity and accountability failure. These were incredibly high-level, responsible people in the Trump administration doing exceptionally stupid things, and none of them seem to be aware of that. On the contrary, there is strong evidence from the text messages released by Mr. Goldberg that this was not the only time this crowd was using Signal to talk about very confidential things. In this Houthi text chain, there are references to, as stated in our previous text or group text and other things like that. Clearly, they have used Signal before. And that is probably a violation of the Presidential Records Retention Act. Do we know exactly what they were discussing in those other texts? No. Were they maybe discussing classified information then? Possibly. Were they discussing classified information in this one? Depends on how you think of it. I'm pretty sure that if I were disclosing attack plans, when are we going to bomb and what are we going to use? Where is it coming from? Sounds classified to me. Or as one columnist I saw put it, if this is not classified information, then what the hell is? Well, these senior leaders, they're either totally oblivious to that higher duty or they're well aware of the higher duty and they didn't care because they were more concerned about their private discussions where they get to do this cosplay national security and their courtiers in the Trump administration who get to have their fancy lives. It sends a terrible signal to the public. It sends a terrible signal to your other employees. Fun fact, according to NBC News, just the other day, a relatively low-level person in the Department of Homeland Security, she accidentally emailed a journalist about forthcoming plans for an immigration raid that she was coordinating with several other ICE immigration officers, and somehow that reporter was accidentally included. And that person is now being investigated and is under paid leave and could very well be fired. So how on earth are we supposed to take any of this seriously if the people at the top don't embrace the tone that they are trying to hold everybody to? There's no accountability here. I will die of shock if anybody gets fired. Although, if I had to say it, I suspect maybe Mike Waltz will get fired for starting this. The person who probably should be fired is Defense Secretary Hegseth, who was the one who really spilled the most valuable intelligence about the attack plans. It astonishes me. So sure, we could dork out about the records retention and policy management obligations here, and maybe there are lessons for larger companies. But really, the lesson is the integrity failure and the accountability failure and the awful tone that is going to send for the rest of the stakeholders in this thing called the United States.
Mr. Armstrong, you've been waiting for this. What do you have?
I have, yeah. I'm gonna betray utter cowardice and not comment too much on the Trump administration so as not to preclude me from ever visiting again. But I'm gonna make a more general point, and by the way, that amnesty may not last. But I'm gonna make a more general point about subject access requests. And I know this sounds tangential, but there's definitely more of a trend towards employees, ex-employees now believing that all the juicy stuff on them is in off-channel communications rather than on. So subject access requests have definitely got more aggressive in the last 18 months, 2 years, I'd say. And most employees or former employees are almost saying, don't give me emails, give me the real stuff. And the more things like this happen, the more that sort of supports that belief that everybody discusses stuff on Signal or Telegram or WhatsApp about employees rather than on the corporate networks. And that then becomes more challenging whenever you're trying to deal with subject access requests, just because the tools aren't as good to ingest that data in and to review it. Then you've got all those conflicts between private lives and public lives. Just because you have an employee's or a co-worker's cell phone number on your device doesn't mean to say that you're conspiring to sack a whole bunch of employees. Just because you're talking about, I don't know, football results via WhatsApp doesn't mean to say you've got a plan to restructure the corporation that you're discussing on WhatsApp as well. And so I think this has real effects for corporations, particularly those with an EU footprint. And whatever the political rights and wrongs of it, off-channel communications are generally bad news.
Jonathan, I'll just pick up on 2 quick points there. First, it's interesting that the implicit assumption behind what you see employees here doing that, oh no, you must have the real goods with me, or that's on WhatsApp or something. It's an assumption of mistrust between the employee to the company. I, employee, do not believe that you, company, are telling me the truth. That is not good for a culture of ethics and compliance. That is the thing that is going to cause all sorts of corrosive bad actions at some point down the future. And second, the closest parallel we have here are these off-channel enforcement actions we did see in the Biden administration. We're never going to see them in the Trump administration, where the Securities and Exchange Commission was sanctioning financial firms which are legally bound to preserve all business communications. So we had dozens and dozens of them busted for using off-channel messaging. And one bank in particular, I can't remember which one, so I won't try to name it, but they had taken a strong approach to try to rectify this, where they understood full well employees are still going to use WhatsApp and Signal and everything else. And that's not the end of the world. You can certainly discuss your lunch plans on Signal, but an awareness of when should we move our conversation onto the approved apps, because now the subject matter has changed and we have a duty to make a record of it, to handle things with care, to not discuss confidential matters on possibly insecure channels. Signal is not as secure as people would like to pretend, certainly not from the prying eyes of adversarial governments. And none of that happened with this Houthi text group here. Nobody was aware or seemed to care that they were talking about very confidential matters when everybody involved, except for Mr. Goldberg, everybody involved had 24-hour access to those secure communication channels where you can talk about classified stuff, because they are government employees and they do have a right and a need to use those channels. And they didn't. They just goofed off. And if any senior executives at a Wall Street bank or probably any company were doing this at your own business, you'd be fired. And that's really what should happen. And this is just another glaring example of how not to do things. Thank you from the Trump administration.
I'm just going to take an HR angle, and there's a reason you're not supposed to drink at work. It's a health and safety issue. And if you drink and are inebriated, there's a distinct possibility that not only you will endanger others, but you'll do something incredibly stupid. So for all of you companies out there who have a policy against inebriation or inhalation of Mary Jane, keep those policies going. So with that, Karen Moore, welcome back.
Thank you. Back safe and sound from that dangerous place called London. So I'm kind of hesitant to dive into the recent omnibus proposal that kind of is designed to simplify current sustainability, due diligence, and reporting requirements, only because I feel like I've had a string of unfortunate circumstances where I early on took a look at the CSDD draft, made a lot of opined recommendations based on that early draft, kind of warned of its imminent adoption. Then the adoption was put on hold. And so I made pronouncements on the death of the CSDD only to have an 11th hour set of amendments and adoption of the CSDD. I feel like by commenting today, I'm dooming this omnibus proposal to also either its death knell or to significant additional amendments and implementation. Nevertheless, it's worth talking about, and we'll see where this goes. So just to remind people, the CSDD and the related CF4D, as well as the EU taxonomy, were part of the EU Green Deal with a real focus on environmental impact and also human rights activities by European companies and throughout their supply chain. As recently as November, there's been wave of concern about the way that these regulations have an impact on EU competitiveness by imposing such stringent reporting and due diligence requirements on the in-scope companies that they're no longer going to be competitive in the world market. And so there's a lot of discussion, really very quick set of recommendations and discussions by top leaders and by the EU administration as well. And so it just in the last few days, the omnibus proposal was published that makes pretty significant amendments to the CSRD, the CSDD, and some of the related regulations. I just want to go over some of those. I think overall, it really does. Some people call it a watering down of this set of proposals and requirements, and others have lauded it as making things a lot more reasonable and giving time for companies to prepare to comply with this. Certainly what it has done is take a lot of companies out of scope. So there are a lot of companies now that maybe are going to be able to sit back and see what's happening with the in-scope companies and how things are working. Let the various EU bodies also take a look at how things are going and make amendments accordingly. Certainly there's a lot of regulations and other best practices that are going to be developed around the CSDDD and the CSRD especially. I do want to remind people, especially my US colleagues, that the CSDDD and the CSRD are directives. They're not regulations. It's not like the GDPR, which was binding and directly applicable across all the EU member states with no further action required, and also with no real changes, nation state to nation state. A directive just provides the objectives and the baseline requirements, but it has to be transposed into national law in a way that achieves those objectives. But we can expect 27 different versions of these requirements. We already have some existing regulations, national laws that have been implemented in France and Germany, for example. But for those of us working in the compliance space, if you think on the whistleblower directive in the EU, we've ended up with not even yet 27 different versions because not everyone has met the deadline for implementing transposed national laws. In any event, with these directives, just as a reminder that even when we get this proposal kind of in place, we're still waiting and looking for 27 different iterations or amendments to existing national law to comply. So we're in pretty complex territory. What changes? Just starting with the CSRD, I think that is one of the biggest changes for some companies. It's already been imposed for the Wave 1 companies, the really large companies, but for Wave 2 companies, it's been pushed back by 2 years. So it takes out of scope companies from the obligation to prepare reports and the in scope or the still in scope companies to have some time to prepare. The CSDDD is also pushed back by a year, so there's some more time there. Most importantly, I think for companies that are evaluating the impact of CSRD and CSDDD, the threshold changes are aligned between the two and the number of companies by an estimated 80%. So there's about 80% of the companies that were in scope, which are now out of scope. So if you really want to talk about that kind of simplification, it also really does narrow down and focus on larger companies. The other thing that has changed, which I think is a significant impact to the now in scope companies, is the value cap in the CSRD, which has been extended now to any suppliers under 1,000 employees, not just small and medium enterprises. So now the scope of the reporting requirements has narrowed down the number of suppliers, and voluntary standards can now be applied to any of those suppliers under 1,000 employees rather than mandatory, not just the small and medium enterprises. With this CSRD, the mandatory reported data points are substantially to be reduced. We're going to see some new directives or regulations or instructions for that. There are going to be a lot less data points that need to be reported, and also no more sector specific standards to be reported. So pretty, again, burden significantly reduced there. The thing I think that is going to excite most people, and certainly going to excite me when thinking about the due diligence implication, is that the CSDDD is now going to apply only to tier 1 suppliers. So what I was calling the blueberry muffin problem, where you needed to go down and find out where your blueberries were grown, you really only have in-depth assessment for tier 1 suppliers, and any kind of tier 2, tier 3, or indirect partners is only going to be required if a company has reason to believe that there's going to be an adverse impact on environment or human rights matters that they may occur or have occurred. So you're only going to have to dive into your supply chain if you have reasonable belief that there's going to be a problem. Also, you don't have to do anything with the voluntary standards for companies under 500 employees. I'm sorry, you shouldn't exceed the voluntary standards for any company under 500 employees within your supply chain. So again, you don't have to go super in depth on those. Another, I think, I don't know if this is a benefit or not, because I think companies should be evaluating this on their own timeline anyway, but the mandatory monitoring under CSDDD has been extended to 5 years instead of annual. So again, a substantially reduced burden on the monitoring. and the obligation to document that monitoring. The termination of non-conforming suppliers has been replaced by suspension. So that's also, I think, some more manageable requirements in your third-party relationships. There's limits to stakeholder engagements in CSDDD. So now it's only directly impacted employees and their representatives, so work unions, work councils, and the like, as well as individuals and the community. So it's limited stakeholder engagement required and pushed back to a later stage in the due diligence process. Interesting, I think, and bearing in mind this directive, so that we've got these individual member states, there is a no longer minimum harmonized penalty under the CSDDD, right? It's not less than 5% of companies' net worldwide turnover. That's been replaced by guidance to be issued to assist supervisory authorities in each of the member states in how to determine appropriate levels of penalties. So there's now going to be, on the one hand, maybe potential for lower penalties, but on the other hand, potentially wide variety in the way penalties are assessed member state by member state. An interesting thing, I think, again, bearing in mind the issues presented by the 27 different versions here, we've got a harmonization change in the proposal under the CSDDD. There's kind of like the CSDDD now acting as a regulatory ceiling rather than a regulatory floor. So there is a limit on the member states' ability to introduce national laws that go further, which is contrary to the usual position that as long as you meet the minimum standards, you can impose more difficult standards. So this maximum harmonization principle is going to cover more of the core aspects of the due diligence process, maybe resulting in a little bit more predictability. So those are really only some of the changes. I think the really biggest change, frankly, is in the scope. So the number of companies that really have to start paying attention and preparing for due diligence and even the reporting requirements for the wave 2 and further. Companies aren't going to really impact as many companies as originally anticipated. And even that original in scope was watered down from the very first set of drafts of the proposal. So I think we're starting to see narrower with an idea not only for simplification and harmonization, but also competitiveness to release a large number of companies from due diligence requirements and reporting requirements. Although interesting, CSRD still has the double materiality standard included. In any event, as I said, I seem to jinx these things by talking about them because we still have the European Parliament and Council have to adopt the Commission's proposals, and then they only actually enter into force once the tri-party agreement is reached. So this either could go away entirely, be substantially changed. We'll see. I do think in the meantime, just like comment that I've made about the potential for deregulation in the US, anytime there's a stepping back on the regulatory front, it gives companies an opportunity, whether they're in scope or not in scope, to really examine their own commitments, the things that are important to them, so that aside from the need to comply with legal requirements, or maybe even coming up with arguments as to why certain requirements don't apply to them, pick and choose the actions that make sense. So I think these conversations need to be had. Sometimes deregulation is a better opportunity to have those conversations about what's meaningful to the company beyond what might be required of the company. I think also the wind is blowing and changing in direction so quickly that it makes sense to at least keep an eye whether you're in scope or out of scope. Documentation becomes even more critical as decisions are made, so that you're kind of making available why decisions are being taken. And then I think that there are a lot of US companies that may have been concerned about falling in scope as tier 2 or tier 3 suppliers under CSDDD. That is that they would be having to respond as a supplier to their European customers. They may be relaxing a bit on that, but again, you need to keep an eye out and see where things are going and what's happening. So that's my take, for what it's worth, on this simplification omnibus proposal. We'll see where it goes. Mostly, I think anything that gives companies more of an opportunity to examine their own processes, the better. We'll see what happens.
Matt, do you have a question or comment for Karen?
I suppose one quick comment and one question. First, to your blueberry muffin scenario, Karen, everybody knows the best blueberries come from Nova Scotia, and they are picked in the month of August. If you are getting your blueberries from some other place at some other time, they are substandard berries.
They are going to be much more expensive, Matt. And as a New Englander at heart, and you as a New Englander in reality, I am disappointed in your dissing of Maine blueberries.
I am waiting for the Mainers who listen to this to send me hate mail, but I'm going to stand by my pledge that Nova Scotia blueberries are the best. But my question is more, what was the threshold again for large companies to be subjected to this? And I'm only thinking of it because the SEC is now abandoning its climate disclosure rule, for better or worse. But I do think large US companies might still need to remember you could get caught up in the EU rules anyways. But so what's that large threshold, or do we know?
Yes, so the threshold is 1,000 employees and turnover, I think it's 50 million. No, I'm sorry, 450 million. It's 50 million for US companies.
I'm going to sit in with a few comments on the world's response to President Trump's executive order suspending FCPA and investigation and enforcement. I'm going to talk about a few disparate topics and see if I could tie them together. The couple of weeks after the executive order was released, I was on webinars for audiences largely outside the United States. And the questions were around the US is not going to lead in this area. Who is? And my response was, you're going to have to lead. And the rest of the world's going to have to lead. And I think we've started to see that in a couple of different areas that I'd like to highlight. The first is the International Anti-Corruption Task Force, which was a joint task force of the United Kingdom, France, and Switzerland. And they made that announcement a couple of weeks ago, and they're going to pool forces and pool resources to do international anti-corruption investigations. The second was Matt and I had the opportunity to visit with Mary Inman this past week on Compliance Into the Weeds. Shout out to Compliance Into the Weeds. We're going to go very meta here with my presentation, and you'll see why in a minute. But Mary just returned from the United Kingdom, where she visited with the director of the Serious Fraud Office about the SFO creating a whistleblower bounty program for tips around violations of English law, specifically anti-corruption. She said that there's currently a whistleblower program, bounty program in place for His Majesty's inland tax revenues. I hope I've got that right. And that the FCA is also looking at having a whistleblower bounty program. So this could potentially draw more enforcement to the United Kingdom. The third area I'd like to highlight is I interviewed Jerry Zak. And for those who don't know, he's the most immediate past president of the SCCE. He attended the OECD Global Anti-Corruption and Integrity Conference, which was held this week in Paris. And he said that obviously this Trump's executive order was a large part of the topics, but he found the approach, particularly the speakers, to be very measured, and that this was simply a change. And if the United States chose to de-emphasize bribery and corruption as a investigative and enforcement initiative, then the rest of the world would pick that up. And he said that there were four general topics that he found the conference around, which was what all of this means for compliance programs, how governments other than the United States are going to respond, using incentives, compliance using incentives to create value for a company, and then data analytics, AI, and other technological advances. He said there were a few harsh questions, I think was the way he phrased it, thrown at some of the panelists, but in large part, they just, the shock and awe of Trump part two is over, and now it's almost business as usual, which surprised me a little bit. Nevertheless, Jerry reported that, and we will post that podcast on Monday for those who are interested in his thoughts on the OECD conference. So I see the beginnings of the rest of the world picking up. I'm certainly saddened, or would be saddened, if the United States loses this leadership. Nevertheless, if Brazil, if Germany, if China, if any of the countries who have had their own prosecutions around anti-corruption step up, it could be a very different world in 2029. It could be a very different world in 2026 even. Let's not forget that China has had a major anti-corruption initiative under Chinese domestic law against GlaxoSmithKline in 2013, 2014. Obviously, Brazil is very advanced. One of the reasons we had so many joint investigations over the past 5 or 6 years has been that the United States Department of Justice and Securities and Exchange Commission work very hard to put on workshops and classes for prosecutors around the world on anti-corruption investigative strategies, tactics, and techniques, as well as enforcement. And we saw that in a series of enforcement actions, particularly around Petrobras in Brazil, but also Airbus, the largest FCPA or anti-corruption fine, international anti-corruption fine, was led by the United Kingdom and France. Switzerland just criminally convicted the former COO of a major trading company. We've seen all of these countries enforce these. I see the rest of the world stepping up. Where all this goes, I'm not quite sure. Nevertheless, I think the United States will lose leadership in this and, well, a much more fragmented enforcement scene going forward. What that means for U.S. companies, I don't think it's going to be anything good. With that, we are off to fan favorites, shout outs and rants. Mr. Kelly has a hard stop, so we're going to ask him to go first, then back over to Jonathan, Karen, and I'll clean up.
Thank you, John. There is certainly quite a lot to choose from here with rants, but I suppose I really wanted to zero in on the news happening this morning that President Trump has pardoned Trevor Milton, convicted fraudster. He of the Nikola Motors Corporation, which in the 2010s, late 2010s, was one of the stock market darlings in alternative energy, where he was building zero emission trucks. That turned out to be a fraud. He was convicted of fraud in 2022, sentenced to 4 years in prison. And the one detail I loved that really summed up and captured the fraud he was trying to perpetrate, he had a video of a zero emission truck that he posted on YouTube rolling along at high speed. However, it subsequently came out that when they recorded that video, the truck was in neutral, coasting downhill, and he had recorded it by framing his camera and holding it the correct way to make it look like it was on a flat surface when it was not. Anyways, Mr. Milton has been in prison for a couple of years. Now he's going to be out because President Trump has pardoned him. Fun fact number one is that Mr. Milton's attorneys were Brad Bondi. If that name rings a bell, it's because he is brother of Attorney General Pamela Bondi, although Mr. Bondi says he was not involved with the appeal for a pardon. However, his other attorney was Michael Mukasey, who, if you remember way back, was acting attorney general back during the waning days of the Trump administration. And Mr. Mukasey was a lawyer for, you guessed it, Donald Trump. He filed a friend of the court brief. So I might stand corrected. I'm not sure if he actually was representing Mr. Trump during the Mar-a-Lago case, but he absolutely was involved in filing friend of the court briefs on Mr. Trump's behalf. And then fun fact number three, Trevor Milton donated $2 million to various Trump PACs this past election cycle, compared to his previous political donations, which were 10,000 here, 10,000 there, that kind of thing. Now he dropped $2 million to support Donald Trump in 2024, while working with a couple of different attorneys who were very close with the Trump administration. And now, lo and behold, we have a fraudster who is going to be out. This clearly stinks to high heaven. Just another example of the lack of attention to any sort of accountability or any attention to the corruption that goes on here. Probably not the last time we're going to see this. Mr. Milton now says he's going to make a movie about his story and how he was, in fact, the victim here. But that is
Mr. Armstrong.
I just wanted to pause for a moment to send my sympathies and condolences with the emerging news in Myanmar/Burma, Thailand, and China, who've been affected by the earthquake. But I wanted to move on to shout out to Russell Brand, the former comedian and one-time actor, who exposed some might say, conspiracy theory some might say absolute truth, that JFK was shot by Penelope Keith, the British comic actress. For those not familiar with the work of Miss Keith, I'd urge you to look at The Good Life on YouTube. She's also in another sitcom called To the Manor Born, where she has a somewhat fractious relationship with her chauffeur/butler. Presumably, it was part of that oeuvre that Brand echoed in his seminal work, Arthur, the remake of the famous Dudley Moore film. But it's hard to contextualize how big a revelation that is for those who are not familiar with the work of Penelope Keith. I guess the closest I could give you is put yourself back to June 1914. You're in Sarajevo. Archduke Franz Ferdinand is driving along in his car, and he's shot by the Golden Girls. I think that's the sort of level of revelation that Brand's work is here. Now, Brand complains frequently that theories of his have no audience in the mainstream media. And there might be three reasons for that, it seems to me. First of all, conspiracy theories like that are often nonsense. Secondly, the mainstream media doesn't feature stories like this because they're nonsense. And thirdly, governments don't comment on stories like this because they're nonsense. Brand, thanks for raising the issues, but maybe we won't come back to you for your forensic evidence behind all of this.
Karen Moore, when you stop laughing, can you share with us a shout out or rant?
Oh, can I also say hashtag free the Golden Girls?
Yes, I'm kind of sorry to follow on that because I think it's nice to end on a laugh. And I'm not going to be talking about something humorous. I want to talk about fear and anxiety rather than fear and loathing, I suppose. The kind of anxiety I grew up with, the fact that we were all going to just die because Russia was going to bomb us with a nuclear bomb and atom bomb. That was kind of the pervasive fear. I think the anxiety for that has gone into the background, although it's still there. We all know now that duck and cover doesn't work, although I engaged in duck and cover exercises in school. No, I would like to talk about fear and anxiety at the moment as evidenced by my recent trip to England. Nothing really to do with the UK itself, however, but my child, who's a grown-up, expressed several layers of anxiety as we attended her uncle's same-sex marriage after having flown transatlantically and also anticipating the flight home with her green card holding father. Anxiety that my child and their contemporary and peers may not be able to engage safely or even legally in same-sex marriage in the near future. That the flight safety was in question as we came over back and forth, not only on a Boeing, but also with reliance on U.S. air traffic control efficacy, and that her green card carrying dad might be denied entry into the U.S. and therefore where would we go and live if not? I think it's really sad that a 25-year-old living in today's first world leader of democracy country should be concerned about the safety of same-sex marriage, of a transatlantic flight, or of the legal ability of an immigrant to re-enter and live safely in the United States. Fear and anxiety, I'm sorry, to follow up on Jonathan, I'm a huge Penelope Keith fan. When I first got engaged to my English husband, I had to be immersed in the sitcoms of his youth, including The Good Life and To the Manor Born, as well as some even way less funny sitcoms.
I'm going to suggest that if Trump really wants to go all out, he needs to, in short order, pardon Sam Bankman-Fried and Elizabeth Holmes. But that's based on Matt's shout out. Actually, I'm going to shout out to opening day of Major League Baseball circa 2025. Yes, baseball is back in all its glory. And I'm going to specifically shout out to my hometown heroes, the Houston Astros, who beat the New York Mets. Jose Altuve, after 12 seasons at second base, moves to left field. Josh Harder struck out Juan Soto to end the game with runners on base. Juan Soto, he of $300 million contract fame. But the best was Cam Smith. Cam Smith was a first-year rookie, and in his first at-bat in front of his parents, friends, and family, he got a hit. So shout out to Cam Smith, shout out to the Houston Astros, and shout out to Major League Baseball. Guys, as always, this has been a ton of fun. I can't wait till we get back together.